So as we prepare for the exclamation of Easter, looking at Holy Week, thanks for joining us again this evening. Luke chapter 23 is where we're going to be. We're focusing on those 7 cries that Jesus gave from the cross of Calvary. Yesterday we listened to those words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And last time as we looked at it, we pointed out that first cry was a fulfillment of prophetic prophecy. In Isaiah chapter 53 verse 12 it says, "For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." So as we look at the second cry this evening here in Luke chapter 23, when Jesus reaches out to the sinner in his last minutes there on the cross of Calvary, he fulfills another prophecy. Again in Isaiah chapter 53 verse 12 it says, "But he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors." One commentator tells us the account of Jesus there on the cross. It said the Roman soldier probably had no idea why he arranged the crosses the way he did that particular day. But God had decreed that he who was most holy should die with those who were most unholy. He wanted to demonstrate the depths of the shame to which his son was willing to go. At his birth he was surrounded by beasts, and now at his death he is surrounded by criminals. So as we look in Luke chapter 23, I think we see some things about this man that we need to look at. Beginning in verse 39 it says, "And one of the malefactors which was hanged railed on him, saying, If thou be Christ, save thyself, and us also. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, Dost thou not fear God, seeing that thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing. And he said unto Jesus, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today thou shalt be with me in paradise." As we look at that this evening, there's a couple things that I think we can take away. First of all, we see a condemned man. We see those 2 men hanging on either side of Christ as condemned men. And it's very likely that they were part of the terrorist cell that Barabbas was leading. And if you know the story there, you know that Barabbas was released instead of Christ there by Pilate. To help us kind of understand who Barabbas was and maybe who these men were, Barabbas would have been the modern day equivalent of Osama bin Laden for us. Just to kind of give you an idea of some of the things that they did. And unbelievably, the people demanded this terrorist be released unto them instead of Christ. And after this account of Matthew 27, we don't hear anything else about Barabbas. No doubt he probably slipped out of the country and ran away. But 2 of his cohorts are not so fortunate. And we see here them publicly being executed next to the one who took their leader's place. This man was condemned to die. He deserved to die for what he had done. His rap sheet was probably as long as his arm. And he was an assassin who had killed for fun, who had killed for profit. He probably would have been hanging on Jerusalem's most wanted posters in the post office there in Jerusalem. He was a condemned man. As bad as that guy was, though, he represents each and every one of us as we think about that. We don't like to think about it that way, but he really was. He represented each and every one of us. We don't want to admit it, that we've all robbed God and that we live in a state of rebellion. But this criminal was condemned, not just because he had broken the laws here on earth, but because he had ignored God and had broken his laws as well. And he had put God out of his mind and just didn't have time for him. He was self-centered. His condition is like us before Christ. Before we accepted Christ, we steal from God the very thing that is most precious to him, and that's our lives. And in Matthew chapter 22 it says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And when we withhold ourselves from him by leading a selfish life, we are in essence stealing from him. So as we think about that, he was a condemned man. On the other side of Christ was a caustic man. As we come to the next scene and kind of hit pause there for just a second, we see this guy. We know from Matthew chapter 27, verse 44, that both of these guys started the day hurling insults at Christ, much like the others there at the foot of the cross were doing. They simply sang their part in the choir of the things going on around the cross that morning. They were condemned, and now they had been crucified. And all that pain and all that agony and all that grief made them very caustic. The man on Jesus' side unleashed all of that bitterness on Christ. It doesn't seem right that these two would taunt and they would mock Christ, the guy in the middle, because Jesus wasn't responsible for what they did. They were responsible for their actions. And yet, we often do the exact same thing. When we allow bitterness to take root in our lives, we lash out at God thinking that it's His fault, that He's to blame. Struggling and in difficulties, those force us to become either bitter or they force us to become better. And the choice is up to us. We grow through them, or we can choose to shrivel up and become caustic towards others, and even towards God. I like the contrast of this picture. While the two terrorists lash out at Jesus, Jesus doesn't say a thing. He doesn't yell back at them. He doesn't scold them. He just simply takes it. He was able to do that because he understood the anger. He understood their pain. He understood their frustration. He knew that sometimes people in pain can be bitter. Finally, we see a changed man. He says, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus says to the man, "Verily, verily, today you will be with me in paradise." No doubt our favorite part of the story, the condemned, the caustic criminal who had committed crimes not only against mankind, but had committed crimes against God Himself, is changed. And that's what I love about Christianity. Jesus changes lives. To see someone take the step to restore a marriage, to restore a relationship, to listen to a man who reclaims his purity, to observe a peaceful spirit where there was once anxiety and stress, to celebrate joy where there was despair, to see financial needs that are met in miraculous ways, to watch wandering children come back to Christ, to see Christians living out their faith. To know that there are a lot of folks in our church who are doing just that. You can't beat that. You can't beat that. I don't know of anything other than a relationship with Christ that can cause these wholesale changes in the heart of somebody, in the thoughts, in the characters, in the words, and even in their behavior. Somewhere between 9 a.m. when he was crucified with Jesus and noon when the sky turned black, we'll get to that later this week, for 3 hours, this criminal totally changed. The Bible doesn't tell us what happened, but we can kind of piece together the details. He apparently saw some things in Jesus that caused him to stop and think. He watched how Jesus faced death. He wasn't cursing. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't complaining like they were. This criminal saw the difference between the one that was ready to die and one who wasn't ready to die. He wondered why these priests in their long flowing robes would have been at the foot of the cross. To do so would have made them ceremonially unclean to worship in the temple. He knew enough about religion to know that they shouldn't be here. Maybe he was a religious rebel. Maybe Jesus was a rebel of some kind, in some way, shape, or form. And it was important for them to be there to see him crucified. If that's the case, then maybe this guy needed to pay attention to Jesus. He heard Jesus' request for forgiveness for the unforgivable. The prayer no doubt pierced his conscience because he knew, as Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He knew he needed that forgiveness. This short sentence became a very saving sermon in that man's life. He heard the inadvertent testimony of the crowd in Matthew chapter 27 when he said he saved others, but he can't save himself. Even though those words were shouted as sarcasm, derision, however you want to call that, He may have meditated on the phrase, he saved others, and he realized he needed saving as well. Maybe he looked up and he saw the sign over Jesus' head. Maybe the first recorded gospel tract that said, the King of the Jews, and he knew he needed someone to reign supreme in his life. He eventually came to realize that he was in the presence of the King, in the presence of the Savior, and he needed saving. He said to the man, verily, verily, today you will be with me in paradise. And I have no doubt when that man took his last breath, he woke up in heaven with Christ. Let's pray. Dear Father, we thank you for heaven. We thank you for that promise of paradise. And Lord, I pray this evening that we just keep that in mind. We're mindful of what you did for us on the cross of Calvary. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And verily today you will be with me in paradise. What a beautiful promise for the Christian. And Lord, we thank you for that. Lord, we thank you for this Holy Week as we celebrate Easter and what that means in our lives.